to held talks on many issues there. We heard from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan talking about especially on economy and trade and we can see the ties are deepening. Syria, Iraq was also discussed. And these were pictures, as we said, live from Ankara there, while Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Russian President Vladimir Putin met. And now we will have TRT World Turkey political correspondent Hasan Abdullah there in Ankara with more on that press conference and on the meeting of the two, and also Julia Yulbova on the reaction there out of Moscow. But let's first go to Hasan there. Hasan, so it seems that ties are deepening there, doesn't it?
That's right, Aisha. Both leaders have described the meetings as fruitful, and there was a lot of emphasis not just on regional issues, in which they mentioned, of course, the KRG referendum, and there was the mention that both are on the same page, and of course they have their reservations about the regional instability that this referendum could lead to. But there was also a lot of emphasis on Syria, and they agreed that it was pertinent that the Astana process was made successful and that the de-escalation zones were implemented as soon as possible, and of course the observers deployed there. Now furthermore, there was also this appreciation from President Putin of the role President Erdoğan played in the initiation of this Astana peace process, and also there was this emphasis on bilateral trade, both sides stressing and emphasizing that the bilateral trade had increased many times, and President Erdoğan there mentioned that the target of taking bilateral trade between the two countries still stands at $100 billion, and both countries are working to achieve that. Furthermore, President Putin also mentioned, and he said that the trade barriers that remain between the two countries, they're working to remove all of them.
And Hassan, I mean, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that long-term peace in Syria is actually possible. We're talking about the war in Syria, and both countries were on opposing sides. How did it get to this point now?
Well, first of all, there was this realization and acknowledgement from Turkey and from Russia that the role the United States, particularly the Obama administration, had played was not very constructive, and that there is this agreement that the US role had been rather indecisive. That led to the escalation of the crisis and to many deaths. And of course, as a result of that, there was this urge and this necessity felt that Turkey, Russia and Iran had to play a role to change the dynamics of this crisis in Syria and to try and de-escalate the situation there, and also to cut down on the casualties there. So of course the three have been working together on this. Turkey and Russia are the key actors in this. They were the initiators of the Astana peace process, so they are working towards it. Now, of course, it is a huge challenge. There are still differences as far as, for example, the definition of opposition groups is concerned, but both sides have been emphasizing that they're trying to reach an understanding over those differences, and this is where they emphasize on the pragmatic nature of relations.
And do we understand from these talks where Bashar al-Assad will be in this picture?
Well, the Turkish position has been that Bashar al-Assad should not have a role in the future of Syria, and the Syrian people should be deciding on their future. They should be democratically electing a representative government, and that is the only way peace could be restored in the long term in Syria. That's the Turkish position. But at the same time, President Erdoğan has repeatedly said that looking at the very high figure of casualties, nearly 500,000 people that have lost their lives there, President Erdoğan has been saying that Turkey is flexible, Turkey is pragmatic, and the first priority for Turkey is to try and reach a humanitarian settlement of this crisis. So there are differences between the different partners, between Turkey, Iran and Russia, and of course they're working on it. But there has also been this emphasis from Turkey that some of its Western allies have not been playing a very constructive role. They've been following and pursuing very self-centered policies, and that are likely to sort of increase this crisis and lead to greater instability in the region.
Well, Hassan, let's keep you there, but get Julia Lyubova in from Moscow for the reaction out of Russia. Hi, Julia. So we understand that this meeting is expected, and it came out of the UN General Assembly while the both presidents were there, and it was discussed on the phone as well, some of the issues. But what do we understand from these deepening ties there? And they both use the same words as fruitful for the meeting.
Yes, that's right. So both presidents, after their meeting, have noted the good level of ties between Russia and Turkey and said that bilateral relations are getting stronger indeed. And as well as discussing their bilateral ties, trade and energy sectors, the two presidents discussed the situation in Syria and in Iraq. Of course, this meeting comes as a follow-up of Astana talks, which took place just a few weeks ago. And then the sides agreed on establishment of de-escalation zones in Syria, and the new round of the next round of those Astana talks are due to take place at the end of October. And of course, this meeting comes at a very important time because operations against Daesh in Syria are entering crucial stages. But also, this meeting between the two presidents comes just days after a controversial referendum by Iraqi Kurds, and the vote backed independence from Baghdad. And of course, this could destabilize the situation in the region immensely and could lead to insurgency in other countries like Turkey, for example, and on the Kurds, not to destabilize the situation and to try to find a solution. And while Vladimir Putin came to Ankara today to try to look for that solution with President Erdogan.
Well, Julia, we know that this war has been going on for 6 years, and Russia and Turkey were on the opposite sides of this war. And now talking, they said long-term peace in Syria is actually possible. And Putin praised Erdogan, saying he was successful on the part of starting those peace talks in Astana there of Syria. So how did it get to this point, and what is the significance?
Well, indeed, of course, Russia and Turkey, they are back in rival sides in the conflict in Syria. But as we have seen from the meeting today, the two sides are increasing their cooperation. Despite this, of course, Russia and Turkey, along with Iran, are the key players in Syria. In Astana, and just in the last round earlier in September, the sides agreed on de-escalation zones, so a huge step forward for the sides. And of course, the next month, so of course, plenty to discuss there for the two presidents today. In that, this meeting comes as Russia and Turkey have finalized the deal to supply S-400 missile system from Moscow to Ankara, and that agreement was signed also earlier in September, and the first payment of the deposit has already been made, and this deal is thought to be worth about $2.5 billion, and the delivery is expected to be made within the next 2 years. While Russia says that this S-400 system has a range of 400 kilometers, a very advanced system there indeed. And of course, this Russian-Turkey contract is a sign of indeed better relations between the two countries, and of course their cooperation when it comes to Syria too.
Well, Julia, let's keep you there, and let's get Hassan back from Ankara. Hassan, so a nuclear power plant was discussed. What do we understand from that project?
Well, there was this mention that, of course, while both countries are trying to increase energy cooperation, there have been some delays. And President Putin there mentioned that an effort is being made to try and remove any obstacles that may be there, that may be slowing down the process. And there was a mention that because of the increased coordination between the two countries, it is likely that the hindrances, the hurdles would be removed soon. No time frame has been defined yet, but the statement we've had from the two presidents suggests that both countries are working on it, and that this energy cooperation would basically be on track.
And we know that it needs improvement, but what do we understand from economy and trade? What was talked in the meeting?
Well, there are still some issues that remain. For example, both countries had been discussing the visa-free regime. Now, Russians can travel to Turkey without visa. Turkey, of course, has not placed any restrictions. And of course, one of the reasons Turkey is citing is the substantial number of Russian tourists who visit the country. But on the other side, Turkey is still waiting for Russia to live up to its part of the commitment and remove this visa restriction on Turkish citizens. And of course, the other issue that is still there is the import of Turkish tomatoes. There are some issues that remain in this that talks are still underway at different levels, not just at the level of the heads of states, but also other technical committees are also looking at these issues. No time frame, again, has been defined, but at least in the case of the import of Turkish vegetables, some officials here are saying that they're expecting this matter to be resolved by the end of October.
Well, Hassan, let's keep you still there and let's get Julia back in from Moscow. Julia, so how is this being, the meeting being perceived by Russians?
Well, indeed, this meeting has been widely televised on state television and certainly has been expected. This meeting was indeed planned, but however, this meeting was planned just a little bit later in the year, but it took place now because of the rapidly changing environment in the region in the Middle East. And of course, Vladimir Putin's visit to Turkey has been widely covered in the media. Of course, as we know, relations between Russia and Turkey have soured a few years back after the downing of a Russian military plane in 2015, and certainly since then, for the last year or so, relations have been on the improvement. Of course, they have been warming up, and we have seen, and as been noted today by both presidents, that bilateral relations between Turkey and Russia are getting stronger indeed. And of course, the sides are working and trying to iron out their differences to make sure that they're getting strong.
Well, thank you very much for that, Julia. I'll get back Hassan there from Ankara. Hassan, so after this meeting, and we know that many issues were talked about, but are we expecting a reaction from the West as the cooperation increases between Russia and Turkey?
Well, yes, there have been some concerns expressed by some of the allies of Turkey. Some of them have been saying that they have been questioning whether Turkey remains a loyal partner in the NATO alliance. What Turkey has been saying, and Turkey has been very persistently saying this, that first of all, this modern international relations should not be viewed as a zero-sum game. Turkish foreign policy is to have good relations with all states, and that, of course, Turkey is pursuing a sort of liberal international economic model. So Turkish position has been that there needs to be greater interdependence between different states. So first of all, Turkish position stresses that there should be no fear from its allies when Turkey improves its relations with Russia. But at the same time, Turkey is also concerned about some of the policies being pursued by some countries, some allies of Turkey that are supporting terrorist organizations like the YPG. So Turkey is saying that while it wishes to have good relations with all, other allies also need to make sure that they're taking Turkey's concerns into account.
Well, thank you very much for that, Hassan Abdullah there from Ankara. Turkey's president has hailed his country warming relations with Russia following the meeting with President Vladimir Putin in Ankara, as it was expected for them to meet after the UN General Assembly. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan said the two countries had agreed to boost economic ties and to meet again next year. And they both said that the bilateral meeting was very fruitful, and will be back on the top of the hour.